to the theme 3, we will discuss this theme of Vikasit Bharat by 2047. What do we mean by Vikasit Bharat to be achieved by this financial year 2047? Remember, India has traversed a path of growth and development for last 75 years since her independence. Through this particular path, we have reached a status as defined by the World Bank, which is referred to as the middle income status. And in fact, the middle income status that we have is the lower middle income status. Now, we want to have a growth and development path for the next 25 years, whereby by 2047, India is going to have her 100th anniversary of political independence from the colonial rule. We want to emerge as a developed nation. By definition, this developed nation for which we are utilizing or we are going to utilize for the next 25 years, we are referring to this as Amrit Kal. So, this entire time period or time variable is technically referred to as Amrit Kal, number one. And number two, for identifying and achieving this status of being a developed one by the year 2047, the roots of and seeds of such effort has begun in 2020, when globe was stuck with the pandemic, which was never seen before. And as it has struck and as it has disrupted the functioning of the economy altogether across the globe, we have faced this challenge of moving out of this particular challenge and coming up with certain resilient growth and development path, whereby such disruptions would not hamper and adversely impact such growth and development path that we are going to have. When this has been done by identifying the principle of what is called as self-reliance. This self-reliance as a principle, was utilized during our freedom struggle. It was there even after the independence, where we want to be self-reliant, whereby we wanted to establish that we are not dependent on the resource requirement on some other particular economy. And now we are saying that we want to be self-reliant in such a way that in spite of any kind of disruption, we are least impacted by such disruption. This self-reliance as an aspect has been showcased in the form of Atmanirbhar Bharat. This Atmanirbhar Bharat 1.0, when it has been announced by the government, it was in fact announced on the basis of 5 of these particular themes. You take into consideration any scheme that was announced post this Atmanirbhar Bharat 1.0. For example, they have announced what is referred to as production linked incentive scheme. This particular scheme has been announced initially for large manufacturing sector, whereby this manufacturing sector would remain agile, and as much as it produces on the basis of revenue it generates, it would also get in relationship with such production or output and the revenue generation certain benefits in terms of incentives by the government through this particular scheme, whereby you are promoting not only the manufacturing but also the job creation within Indian economy. And this has been done as part of this Atmanirbhar Bharat alone. As we are seeing that this is going to be very agile and reform oriented. As you see this, there are 5 such identified markers that the Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India has to focus upon. One is referred to as economy, and this economic growth and development would be relying upon the sustainable and resilient infrastructure that you develop, for both of which to occur. It is the systemic reforms which have to be ensured, and on the other hand, 3 of these, that is economic growth and development, the infrastructure creation and the systemic reforms that you want to bring about, all of these must focus upon 2 fundamental requirements. One is referred to as demography. Demography as one parameter has been considered in order to promote the other 3. If you recall, the sample registration system in 2019 came up with a report in which it has mentioned that the birth rate in India has fallen below even the replacement birth rate level that has been designated at 2.1, by which it means that there is a significant demographic change that is occurring in Indian economy, number one. And number two, if you look at the average age of the entire demographic structure that India has, it is somewhere lying at 28 years. As we see, given this youth age of the population as a characteristic for the entire demography, there has to be a meaningful way and path in order to make sure that this benefit is reaped by the economy. This is what we refer to as demographic dividend. And this demographic dividend has another particular advantage. This demographic dividend, when it is self-reliant, by which we mean that it is able to generate not only the gainful employment by participating in the production, the income levels that they generate for them by participating in the production process would be leading to the expenditure or the consumption levels in the economy, which is what we see in the form of what is referred to as demand. So there are two fundamental planks of growth and development that India is trying to focus upon. One is reaping this demographic dividend, and by reaping this demographic dividend, we want to have a demand-led growth within Indian economy, even when you are aiming at exports-led growth. This is the basic fundamental parameters that the government of India was considering when it was announcing this so-called Vikasit Bharat. In this Vikasit Bharat, as you see, in order to achieve that sustainable development, inclusive development, we need to focus upon three fundamental things. One is there has to be social development, and this social development must be in sustainable manner. Then alone the economic development would be sustainable. As you clearly see that the relationship between social development and economic development and social development and environmental development are very much in symbiotic relationship. However, it is the other relationship that you are seeing here where the economic sustainability and the environmental sustainability, both of these are mutually impacting in such a way that the growth and development strategy that the globe has followed, including India and China particularly, you see that both of them are acting inversely with each other. It is this which makes very fundamental in terms of the growth path that you are adopting. Given this particular aspect, we see here that the development mantra has been devised by the government, and it says the Sabka Saath and Sabka Vikas, where economic development and social development in a sustainable manner is being referred to here. Whereas, in order to have this, it has added another component that it has to have the trust of everyone. This trinity of demography, democracy, diversity, backed by the hard work from everyone, would be leading us to this destination of Vikasit Bharat by 2047. As I said, for this to be achievable, you need to have an economic development which is sustainable environmentally. This is where the developed India at 2047, which is referred to as Vikasit Bharat, is focusing upon. What you see here is some of the learnings we have from the World Bank studies, which has also been studied by the Niti Aayog, and this has been adopted when the government was coming up with this particular budget statement. That is, whenever there is economic growth occurring, whenever the economic growth is occurring, keep in mind that we have to focus upon the economic growth which is long term. And the long term economic growth, as we see, as suggested by Simon Kuznets, will lead to what is referred to as the structural transformation. For this structural transformation to occur over this long-term period, there are certain very positive and beneficial effects that must happen within the economy. The first such beneficial aspect has to be, as you grow higher, we see in the world data that the population-based distribution of income that happens will lead to a situation wherein poverty would be coming down. You clearly see that as the GDP per capita, that is per capita income, is increasing, you would see that the poverty levels within those economies are also declining. So over long-term periods, this long-term growth rate as a strategy will have this beneficial effect. On the other hand, in spite of the fact that this beneficial effect is seen, the long-term growth is unable to address one particular social exclusion, that is inequality. And this is where policy truly matters. And how it matters and what has been the strategy of India with respect to this in order to achieve Vikasit Bharat by 2047, we will see it a bit later. The second aspect that you have to see is that as the long-term growth is occurring, what you see is the literacy levels are also increasing, and you will be ultimately achieving that level of near 100% literacy levels. And particularly this has to happen with regard to the female literacy. So as the GDP per capita, that is per capita income, which represents the distribution of income within the economy, will be having another such beneficial effect. And this has to translate into what we refer to as labor force participation rate within that particular economy. And this is where, in fact, our labor force participation rate pertaining to females is below the global average of 50%. This is another concern that we have, because of which we want to adopt the gender budgeting as a strategy in order to make sure that females are also participating in this, and then we will be achieving this so-called Vikasit Bharat by 2047. Third, we have wherein this is referring to the health indicators of any particular economy. As you achieve more growth rates during the long-term periods, you would see that gradually the child mortality rate, that is the children who are under 5 age, will be reducing. As this is reducing, it means that you are going to have a demography which is more healthier in terms of next generation. This healthier generation that you are going to have for the future is going to reap again benefits for your economy. On the other hand, this long-term growth strategy is also having another beneficial effect in terms of environmental sustainability. What you see here is over long-term periods, as the growth is bringing in more and more income for the people, it is also trying to lower what is referred to as, for example, this PM10 concentration at the local levels. So these visible pollutants are absent. So in terms of environmental sustainability also, long-term growth is going to be beneficial. However, there is one such area in terms of which the long-term growth statistically or empirically has clearly shown failed results. That is, as you are growing more, what you are seeing is gradually the emissions of CO2 are tending to increase. It is these two where one is related to the demography and the other one is related to the environment. The effort has to be specifically targeted such that the sustainable social, economic and environmental development would be possible. It is in this particular context we have to see Vikasit Bharat as a theme. The first effort, as we have clearly seen, that long-term growth strategy is declining or enabling to decline this condition referred to as poverty. As we clearly know that poverty is a condition where you will be deprived of certain basic requirements. This deprivation is showing a decline because of the measurement that we have, which is referred to as multidimensional poverty. We clearly know that in 2011, Oxford University has come up with this multidimensional poverty, which has three fundamental indicators, as we have already seen. One is referred to as the standard of living. The other one is referred to as the literacy levels or educational attainment levels. And the third one, which is also a part of this human development, is referred to as the kind of standard of health that the economy has. With respect to three of these, there are 10 such indicators that Oxford University has picked up in order to come up with this multidimensional poverty index. To three of these parameters, India has added two more dimensions. One is maternal mortality rate, which is referred to as MMR, and then another one is the opening of the bank accounts. Given these two parameters being included, suddenly it has shown a figure wherein the multidimensional poverty in India has radically declined. This multidimensional poverty index, which measures this so-called decline in the poverty headcount ratio, which means that number of population who are poor out of total population, their ratio or this ratio is declining. This is what this particular figure is showcasing. As this is decline, it is this long-term growth strategy which is actually showing such impact by distributing the incomes and then causing this decline in the multidimensional poverty. One such measure which is actually helping Indian government as of now to make sure that this multidimensional poverty is gradually declining, whereby social, economic and environmental sustainability development is occurring, is this direct benefit transfer scheme, which is leading to savings of nearly 2.7 lakh crore as it indicates. Number 3, the government has also come up with a specific targeted strategy as it indicates. If there is any vulnerable section within the demography, then it wants to translate this vulnerability into some benefit for that particular community. One such scheme is the PM Swanidhi scheme, where it is giving the financial assistance to particularly street vendors who were affected by the pandemic. And this had been continued in order to make sure that these street vendors are also becoming self-sustainably resilient with respect to the incomes that they are earning. So this Pradhan Mantri Street Vendor Atmanirbhar Yojana that the government has come up with is enabling this most vulnerable section who are vulnerable to any kind of shock to the economy are being given with certain financial assistance to make sure that they are self-sustaining themselves. Second component that you see is, apart from poverty, they are focusing upon this demographic dividend called youth. As we have clearly seen that the average age of India as of now is at 28 years, and hence the required things for these youth are twofold as we have identified. One is the skill requirement and another one is jobs and financial requirement, and both of these are being focused upon through this particular budget. As you see, one, the Skill India mission is trying to come up with this Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0, where we have implemented 3 such versions of Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and this 4th version is going to be implemented now. You have to keep in mind that in terms of job creation and in terms of reap their benefits, in order to make sure that they are adapting to the changing economic conditions, skilling, reskilling and upskilling has been made a component of this Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. This is what ultimately gives rise to the job opportunities or job creation and in terms of even the entrepreneurship. And if you look at the macro level situation, the government has what is referred to as Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, under whose supervision this is being implemented. On the other hand, we also have what is referred to as PM Mudra Yojana, giving those loans to all those youth who have skilled themselves in order to come up with their own entrepreneurial ideas. In this, if you look at, there are 3 kinds of components. One is called as Shishu, where you get a loan component of up to 50,000 rupees. Then you have Kishore, where you get a loan component up to 5 lakhs from 50,000 to 5 lakhs. And then you have what is referred to as Tarun, where you get loans up to 10 lakhs. And 3 of these components are catering to different requirements of youth based on different skill sets that they have attained. On the other hand, recently, government has also come up with what is referred to as PM Shri, wherein at the level of education itself, adapting children to this new education policy, it has set up more than 14, it is planning to set up more than 14,000 Pradhan Mantri schools for rising India. This PM Shri schools, as you clearly see, again has received more budgetary allocation in the current interim budget that they have announced. Particularly with regard to higher education, that too skilled education, government has clearly made sure that it is the state-led education is catering to the requirements of the people. On the other hand, if you look at the third component of this Vikasit Bharat, the third component is related to farmers. The agriculture sector and the farmers who are the backbone for this agriculture sector is ridden with certain very fundamental distortions. In order to address that, the government has certain components and which has been continued even through this particular budget. One such component is PM Kisan, where a fixed amount would be transferred to or disbursed to through this direct benefit transfer to all the farmers who own a piece of land. This includes even the small and marginal farmers. Through this particular scheme, government is trying to gradually make sure that there is a shift from the current mechanism of MSP towards what is called as universal basic income. this universal basic income strategy, as you see through this PM Kisan, is being implemented even in the multiple states. Given the fact that MSP mechanism, in fact, as a market intervention mechanism, has led to certain distortions within the agriculture. Second, the major component that is hindering the welfare of the farmers is this requirement of crop insurance. Whenever there is failure of crop, it is adversely impacting the welfare of the farmer. The PM Fasal Bima Yojana is clearly in that particular direction. Third, you have what is referred to as this ENAM, wherein some of the primary agricultural markets have been brought under this particular ENAM. ENAM tries to make sure that the farmers and the buyers would be meeting in that particular market, which is electronic. Government was trying to come up with certain reforms in the agriculture sector. However, these reforms had to be hindered because of certain loopholes that the bills had, and it had to ultimately withdraw those agricultural bills. However, these marketing reforms are backbone to the revival of agriculture in India in a sustainable manner. And it is this requirement which is making the government continue what is referred to as ENAM. So this ENAM, as you clearly see, is helping the farmers to make sure that the meaningful income is getting generated through this e-mandis. On the other hand, the government is also going for increasing procurement, particularly of these cereals, even though it has in a way distorted the structural functioning of the agriculture. And as you clearly see here, it is also on the rise. Last component that you have here as part of this Vikasit Bharat 2047, that is focusing upon both demography and demand, is this demographic component of women. In this particular component, the first component that you have to focus upon is the increasing female participation in the labor force participation rate. Second, you clearly see that the female enrollment in higher education has reached to higher levels. 3, their enrollment even in the science, technology, engineering and medicine, that is more advanced courses, as you see, which is the symbolic of movement of the society from one particular ridden structure to an advanced scientific temperament based structure. This particular enrollment showcases the empowerment of women that is gradually occurring. On the other hand, the government has come up with what is called as Lakpati Didis for rural women who are members of these self-help groups, wherein it is trying to make sure that they are earning a minimum of 10,000 rupees per month, or to make sure that in a particular year they are able to make a definite income of 1 lakh rupees. Accordingly, they would be trained. So you have these 4 components which are part of this Vikasit Bharat strategy. Alongside, in order to make sure that this Vikasit Bharat is occurring, we clearly have seen that infrastructure has to be the focus. As you see here, the physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure and social infrastructure, along with the digital payment ecosystem as part of this digital infrastructure that has been created, is trying to bring up this inclusive development as a strategy. On the other hand, the widening of the tax base, not only in the direct tax component but also in the indirect tax component, is giving further leverage to the government to come up with this particular Vikasit Bharat strategy, wherein its role is going to be more and more proactive. And as you clearly see that the financial sector within Indian economy has also been strengthening, whereby it is bringing in more savings and more credit and hence more investment into the economy. This is also adding to the growth potential of the economy. On the other hand, we also are open to the external investments that would come into India, and this gift city is trying to manage that. That proactive inflation management that RBI has done is also keeping inflationary levels stable within India, wherein it is within that particular zone of 4 to 6% as part of inflation targeting framework. And moreover, in order to achieve the regional balance in terms of such growth and development, now specifically India is targeting at the eastern states in order to make sure that they are also on the path of economic growth and development. We have seen that interrelationship between the social development, economic development and the environmental development. And 3 of these have to be, as we have seen, sustainable. In order to make environmentally sustainable, which is sustaining the economic development, then there are two things which are very, very essential. One, as we have clearly seen till now, that the social development must happen, and we are seeing that this is happening on the basis of the demographic dividend that we have assessed. On the other hand, the environmentally sustainable economic development would be possible only when, as you have seen already from the analysis that we have done, that the energy transition to green energy, renewable energy must happen. So this energy transition becomes the fundamental plank for environmentally sustainable economic development. In order to achieve this, India has laid out its own roadmap. We know clearly about this. In this particular roadmap, as you are seeing here, in 2022, as of now, we see that India is, as this color coding scheme is also indicating, probably the carbon intensive as of now, even though per capita consumption or release of the carbon dioxide is lowest across the world. On the other hand, by 2050, when you become, as it is estimated, a GDP of the size of $12 trillion, the energy consumption would also be increasing accordingly to the extent of this 56 joules. And here, as you clearly see, that the share of carbon fuels, or rather the share of zero carbon fuels, would also be increasing in this particular effort to become $12 trillion economy. As you see this happening, the reduction in the CO2 emissions would also be ensured. Once you come up to the 2070 financial year, whereby you would have become a economy which is of the size of $27 trillion, by when we also assume that India would be still a Vikasit Bharat, then at this particular juncture, the share of zero carbon fuels would be increasing, and India would be emitting least carbon dioxide into the environment. And in spite of the fact that higher energy utilization would be there given the size of the economy, still we would be a net zero economy in terms of carbon dioxide and its release by this year of 2070. This is the roadmap that we have laid. Accordingly, this budget has come up with certain initiatives. For example, in this particular initiative, it is saying that the new scheme for biomanufacturing and biofoundry has been initiated, and in this particular initiative, as it says, it is going for environment-friendly alternatives such as manufacturing these biodegradable polymers or bioplastics, biopharmaceuticals and bioagri inputs. On the other hand, we also know that on the day of consecration of Lord Sri Ram at Ayodhya, Prime Minister has announced a rooftop solar energy scheme for nearly 1 crore households out of 30 crore households as we estimate. And this particular rooftop solar energy scheme is going to benefit the households who have not benefited from the 100% rural electrification scheme that we have implemented so far. And by definition, we know that even though we are 100% electrified, still we find that some of the households are left without any electricity connectivity. And in order to provide this, rather than going for grid connectivity, we are going for this solar rooftop scheme in which these households would be benefiting, and eventually this will also be connected with the grid that we have in India. So in this way, we are trying to bring about initiatives which are environmentally sustainable, while it is providing the necessary inclusive growth, and also it is providing the necessary push for the economic development. Lastly, this particular slide clearly shows you that this economic growth, in order to reach that stage of developed economy, must be on the basis of her potential. And the potential is clearly showcased in this particular graph. On the one hand, the growth of the entire world economy is at the lower levels. It is India which is going to show the growth rates which are higher than the world economic growth at an average, and hence the potential growth for the economy has also been established depending upon the macroeconomic fundamentals which are stable within the Indian economy, and hence this is possible according to this interim budget. The possibility is of Vikasit Bharat by 2047. Moving to the next theme, we will discuss this fiscal policy strategy. Amidst various concerns with regard to the fiscal deficit targets, whether the government would be able to achieve these fiscal deficit targets or not. The government has come up with a fiscal policy strategy which has surprised everyone. You see here that the fiscal deficit targets that the FRBM Act mandates is very, very clear. You have to limit the fiscal deficit up to 3% of the GDP. Then you have to have what is referred to as general government debt, that which includes the union government debt and the state government's debt to the extent of 60% of GDP alone, wherein the central government debt can be at 40% of GDP and the state government's debt has to be 20% of the GDP by 31st March 2025. This had been the target that the FRBM Act has set. However, given the various challenges that we have encountered post-pandemic, this again has to be postponed. But looking at the way in which we are moving ahead with respect to this achievement of deficit targets, we are on the right track. And government says that it uses this expression glide path. And the glide path is very, very clear that we are trying to rationalize these fiscal deficits that India is encountering. On the other hand, we also have what is referred to as government's priority with regard to, as we have clearly seen, inclusive development. And this inclusive development would be possible when you address the welfare related expenditures to meet up the expenditure requirements of the vulnerable sections of India. Given this, you have to keep in mind that even though the long-term strategy is able to address poverty scenario, as we have seen in earlier theme, we must keep in mind that at the policy level and also at the growth strategy level, this phenomenal long-term economic growth, not just in developing economies but also in developed economies, has failed to address one particular phenomenon apart from the environment-related phenomenon. That one particular phenomenon is inequality. It couldn't bring about equality in terms of equality of the regions, equality in terms of sectional development, sectoral development. This couldn't be brought about. It is this which had to be taken care of at the policy level. In order to do this and in order to have inclusive and equity-based development in Indian economy, this is very, very significant. Second, government is also accelerating the capital expenditure to boost economic recovery. Post-pandemic, this had been the strategy. Government has followed what is referred to as barbell strategy. If you recall, post-pandemic barbell strategy, and this had been adopted from the understanding of finance. In this particular barbell strategy, the one aspect of it would be to focus upon what is referred to as systemic reforms, but on the other aspect of barbell strategy, given this crisis is giving you as an opportunity, you will be focusing upon hand-holding the vulnerable sections apart from moving ahead with the possibility of capital expenditure, such that this capital expenditure over time will lead to what is referred to as crowding in effect for private investment. It is referred to as crowding in effect. So you encourage the private sector by participating in the infrastructure development or any other such requirement, whereby you are inviting private sector to participate through these models of public-private partnerships. On the other hand, as we have already discussed, by following this calibrated approach that the government of India has adopted since the post-pandemic recovery phase, we don't have any outline on medium-term fiscal projections. This clearly is based on the fact that there are certain global factors which are impacting the entire global economy in terms of these geopolitical tensions that have emerged, whether it is in Middle East or in the Red Sea region or even in the Central Asian region. On the other hand, these tensions are impacting the supply chain and value chain flow that we used to have. And number three, more importantly, we see a situation wherein the hyper-globalization phase that has started ending in 2015-2016 roughly is still showing this path of slowing down. Also have the challenge of domestic economy facing certain challenges. Given this, government is not projecting any immediate strategy in order to rationalize the fiscal deficit targets, rather than it is going with what is referred to as glide paths. On the other hand, Government of India has made certain commitments. In these particular commitments, it said that by 2025-2026 financial year, it will be approaching this 4.5% of GDP targets with respect to the fiscal deficit. For the current financial year, through this interim budget, it said it will bring it down to 5.1% as against whatever the projections that the other economists were making, which might be around 5.3%. On the other hand, even with respect to the current fiscal deficit target, government said we will be able to achieve it. Moving ahead, we see certain trends with regard to these deficits, which is what important both for the preliminary and main examination. On the one hand, you will see that the fiscal deficit, which has fallen gradually over the years, during which India was also going through a phase of slowdown, all of a sudden, you would see that in 2018-2019 financial year, there was a fiscal push, and given this, there was slowdown in the economy, and all of a sudden, as the pandemic has set in, the fiscal deficit has skyrocketed. From there, the fiscal consolidation has begun, and it is showing signs of getting consolidated over these particular years. On the other hand, even if you see the revenue deficit target, much of the revenue deficit was there in 2020-2021 financial year, again because of the pandemic, and you see that it is same and true with respect to effective revenue deficit and the primary deficit. And you see that all of these are in the phase of getting rationalized. On the other hand, the focus had to be on this so-called revenue deficit and then effective revenue deficit. In terms of these trends, as the government was not able to bring down the revenue deficit targets to zero, it said we will have what is referred to as effective revenue deficit. Within this effective revenue deficit, it will also include those revenues which have been transferred to states, and these have been utilized for capital expenditure. Removing that, the effective revenue deficit would be at 0.8% for this particular financial year that we are estimating, that is for 2024-2025 budgetary estimates. On the other hand, even the primary deficit is showing the trends of getting rationalized. We clearly know that primary deficit is a marker in order to see how far we are able to meet up with interest payment obligations. It is this which is showing another healthy trend. As you clearly see in this, these are the targets, some of the targets that the budget is mentioning. These are important for the preliminary examination. On the other hand, as there is this deficit, it has to be financed, and this financing is what we refer to as deficit financing. What are those various sources of deficit financing? Clearly, you see that the market borrowings is the first source. So, as there is deficit, you are borrowing from the market, and this stood at the highest levels even in this particular financial year. On the other hand, you also have the short-term borrowings, and you also have the requirement in terms of securities against small savings. It is this aspect of securities against small savings which is the component that you are seeing here as the larger bar, which is what actually concerning the Indian economy. As you clearly know, as we have discussed in the earlier theme, wherein the small savings would be falling in the zone of public account of India. And we clearly see that this public account of India is out of any approval from the parliament. So, there will not be any parliamentary scrutiny over this and parliamentary control over this. So, the government is at free hand to borrow money from this particular account. On the other hand, as we have clearly seen, government raises small savings and provident fund, and this money is getting disbursed into the public account. As this particular money is disbursed into public account, you clearly see here that state or government is acting as a bank. As the treasury is acting as a bank here, you call this what is referred to as treasury banking. And in this treasury banking, you are raising money. In case of any particular bank such as ICICI or HDFC, any other such scheduled commercial bank you have, by definition, they raise money and they act as an intermediary, and someone else would be borrowing this money. But in the case of treasury banking, what you are seeing is government is acting as a bank, and it is the government itself which is borrowing this money, which again goes against the principles of financial prudence. It is this which is concerning. Hence, borrowing money by issuing securities against the small savings is against the principles of financial prudence. Number two, we also see that as this is out of purview of the public account, this money, whatever has been raised by the government in order to source the deficit financing, is not subjected to any kind of voting for within the floor of the parliament. On the other hand, this will also not get reflected in the fiscal deficit, but this will be there as part of meeting the fiscal deficit target. So there is a accounting discrepancy that you also see within this particular aspect. Moving ahead, you also have, as you see in this particular picture, other receipts which are in the form of internal debts and public account. And in this other receipts, you see that in spite of continued use of these receipts, now you are showing a reduction in these particular receipts. So we are not utilizing this particular money. This you have to keep in mind. Second, in terms of what is called as deficit financing and its sources, the first major component is market borrowing in the form of dissect, which is the long-term borrowing. The second component is the securities which are issued against small savings, and the third component is these short-term borrowings. So this is the order in which you have to remember these particular sources of deficit financing. On the other hand, within this, with respect to tax revenue, government has come up with certain reforms. Clearly, you find that the direct tax collections have trebled in last 10 years as it claims. Second, the tax base is also increased to more than 2.3% or 4%. And number 3, we also see that the processing of refunds has also attained certain pace, and this pace is showing the efficiency of the functioning of the tax structure. On the other hand, with respect to indirect taxation, these taxes have shown a resilience wherein these tax collections, on an average, the monthly collections have stood at 1.66 lakh crore in this particular financial year. Moreover, with respect to tax buoyancy, wherein which shows that the possibility of tax revenue growth would be there in future, the potential growth rate for the tax revenues is also visibly strong because of the fact that it is over and above 1, as this particular figure shows. On the other hand, you also see that the government has brought about certain scheme wherein retrospectively whatever the litigations we have as part of the tax litigations, this will be resolved at one go because government wants to completely abolish these litigations by introducing this scheme. So as part of this Vivad Se Vishwas scheme, up to 10,000 rupees and up to 25,000 rupees, whatever the litigations were there, these litigations will no more be there, freeing the people from these litigations. As you recall, this is what Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas and Sabka Vishwas, as this was mentioning. On the other hand, there is also a positive sentiment as it is being expressed by the industry leaders. There is one pattern that you have to keep in mind which might be important for the preliminary examination. There were very few occasions when the personal income tax contribution towards the tax revenue was higher than the corporation tax. It is one such financial year wherein you are seeing this trend, and this has also been projected for the next financial year. This has happened in history only 3 times post-liberalization reforms. On the other hand, you also see that both of these as single entities were even higher than the GST. It is these trends that you have to keep in mind with respect to taxation related patterns. Moving ahead, you also have another component which is significant in terms of cooperative federalism. Government is transferring these revenues to states, and these transfers are occurring on the one hand because of the devolution, number 2 because of certain schemes and the transfer that the government makes because of those centrally sponsored schemes that it has introduced, and number 3, there are certain finance commission grants as part of which again these transfers have to occur. What you are seeing is year on year these transfers are increasing. This indicates the functionality of fiscal federalism within India. Second, as you clearly see in this particular picture, the devolution of taxes towards the states year on year is increasing clearly. And number 3, as you see in this picture again, because of the centrally sponsored scheme, the state governments have been endowed with more and more responsibility, because of which the transfers are also increasing. So you clearly see in this the functioning of the cooperative federalism as this budget statement was indicating. Moving to the next theme, we will discuss few miscellaneous announcements which have been made with respect to some of the key sectors that we have already identified. One such particular key sector is the infrastructure and capital expenditure that the government is doing in terms of investment. As you clearly see here, the budgeted capital expenditure led by the government is at this level of 3.4% of GDP. And you can clearly see now that even though the capital expenditure through the budget for the government is increasing, on the other hand, as you clearly see, the public capital expenditure through the resources of public enterprises is on the decline sustainably and continuously. Second, as a share of total expenditure, this is coming to the tune of 23.3%, which is highest in these 32 years. This entire effort of public capital expenditure, which is leading the growth process of the Indian economy, is to make sure that it is pulling in the private investment through crowding in effect, and on the other hand, it is also making the economic growth sustainable in the longer term. On the other hand, you also see that 46% of such investment by the public capital expenditure is actually going to the hard infrastructure sector such as roads and railways. So the PM Gati Shakti master plan that the government is implementing with regard to 7 of those core infrastructure sectors, the bulk of the sum is going to these particular sectors. On the other hand, if you look at the disinvestment portion of the government's efforts, you will see that year on year, even though the estimates are at higher levels, what has been realized through actuals has been pretty low. So the disinvestment is one area where the fiscal policy strategy is actually not going according to the fiscal policy statement that is being issued by the government. On this particular point, if you recall the concept of fiscal marksmanship, which deals with the issue of least gap with respect to the actual estimates that the government is presenting and also the actuals that the government is realizing. If this gap is low, then the functioning of the fiscal strategy, fiscal policy is prudent. Now moving to the next slide, if you look at the scenario of increase in capital expenditure, as you can clearly see here, the capital expenditure as percentage of GDP is flattening, even though we see that in absolute terms it is increasing. As you can clearly recall, it is at 3.2% of GDP. On the other hand, when we were saying that it is the physical infrastructure which is attracting much of these investments, you can clearly see that the national highways and airports are receiving much of the investment through the public capital expenditure. On the other hand, you would also see that the railways is the third component which is receiving this particular capital expenditure. Moreover, if you look at the PM Gati Shakti scheme that we were referring to, the 3 aspects of improving logistics efficiency and reducing the cost, number 1, and number 2, improving the comprehensive development of new airports through the UDAN scheme, whereby it is bringing in this airport sector and the air travel to the ordinary citizen as it has declared. Number 3, we also have promotion of urban infrastructure, whereby the urban transformation would be happening through metro rail and Namo Bharat. All these 3 components which are part of this so-called PM Gati Shakti master plan is the ones which are receiving bulk of the investments. On the other hand, if you look at this particular graph, it is referring to what is called as effective capital expenditure. The capital expenditure is one aspect. Effective capital expenditure includes even that revenue expenditure which is going to the states, whereby states were asked to utilize these revenue funds in order to go for the capital expenditure from the states. It is this which makes up what is referred to as effective capital expenditure. As you can clearly see that this effective capital expenditure is also showing this figure of 15 lakh crore. Moving to the infrastructure development, which is again another component that you have seen in this entire Vikasit Bharat strategy. On the one hand, you clearly see that the hardcore infrastructure is being given push through public capital expenditure. On the other hand, within this infrastructure development, government is also trying to bring in this element of inclusive development by building houses through what is referred to as PM Awas Yojana, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Gramin, and also coming up with certain new announcement for the urban dwellers, particularly those who are living in the slums and other such areas. This is catering to the inclusive development requirements, and this was much required because these were the ones which were subjected to exclusion, as you see, and this is what is actually contributing to the elimination of poverty that you were seeing earlier in the form of the multidimensional poverty index that we have clearly seen. On the other hand, in terms of infrastructure development, government is also specifically focusing upon the infrastructure development pertaining to tourism sector. This is another component which is receiving fillip, and this fillip is being given post this G20 summit. And we can clearly see that this G20 meetings being held in diverse 60 places, as it has been said in the document. This is catering to the arrival of number of tourists, and as you see that the tourist arrival has increased. So the development of tourism related infrastructure, which is being encouraged through what is referred to as long-term interest-free loans that will be provided to states to encourage such tourist infrastructure development. Moving ahead, you have this aspect of inclusive development, within which you clearly see that aspirational districts specifically are being focused upon. And with respect to these aspirational districts, as you see in the budget document, the most important focus had been on what is referred to as the precarious health indicators that have been seen with respect to these districts as reported by Niti Aayog. Hence, health-related indicators, for example, the cancer vaccination for girls or the Poshan Abhiyan in terms of the nutrition requirement to the females, and then the aspect of UWIN platform for immunization efforts in order to roll out this mission Indradhanush in these particular districts, and also the health coverage that the government is providing under Ayushman Bharat scheme, which is to be extended even to the Asha workers and Anganwadi workers and other such helpers. All these are parts of these efforts to make sure that there is inclusive development. Moving ahead, we have the sectoral allocations which have been made, which have been prominently mentioned, particularly the agriculture and allied sectors, which has shown a declining growth rate or slowing down to the 1.8% of the GDP. And as you see that this slowdown is there, the agriculture and food processing, both of these put together have been subjected to some fillip within this particular interim budget, particularly the Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana, which has been given a fillip in order to push the fisheries sector in India. As you can clearly see that it is planning to set up 5 different aqua parks within the territory of India. On the other hand, you can clearly see that in order to implement what is referred to as Blue Revolution, the allocation have been increased in this particular budget. Along with this, the formalization of micro food processing enterprises scheme, which has been announced in order to give fillip to those very small food processing units that you would see, and this has also been given some fillip at the grassroots level. On the other hand, agriculture will be receiving what is referred to as private and public investment, particularly in the post-harvest activities where the investments was lacking according to the government. Number 3, it is also made sure that combining the agricultural sectoral development and rationalizing the aggressive fertilizer use that you see in India alongside what you refer to as the importance of sustainable development pertaining to agriculture. You would see that this nano DAP has been expanded to all agroclimatic zones, whereby the utilization of the fertilizer would be rational. On the other hand, government through this Atmanirbhar Oilseeds Abhiyan, which has been formulated to achieve the self-reliance with respect to oilseeds cultivation, it is being promoted in order to make sure that the imports burden of these oilseeds can be reduced, such that even the foreign currency that we have as part of foreign reserves can also be preserved. On the other hand, the comprehensive program for dairy development is also being formulated, wherein the integrated scheme would be implemented with respect to this. On the other hand, if you look at some of the allocations which have been made with respect to the ministries, this is the order in which the allocations have been made. The highest allocations have been made to the Ministry of Defence, and then the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, Ministry of Railways, Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution. It is this order which becomes important. And if you look at the allocations, including those the government is spending on the interest payments, then the interest payments component is what? The highest in this order of allocations that the government has made. This you have to keep in mind. Moving ahead, you have number of schemes that the government is implementing as part of the budgetary process. Out of these many schemes, keep in mind there are certain schemes which are referred to as core of the core schemes. There are certain other schemes which are referred to as core schemes. There are certain other schemes which are referred to as centrally sponsored schemes and then central sector schemes. All these schemes and this differentiation you have to remember. And if you look at the various categorizations of these particular schemes and what are those major schemes which are being implemented, if you look at the core of the core schemes, you have MGNREGA program which is being implemented, which is the first important core scheme for which the allocation has been increased to 86,000 crores. And then you have the second scheme which is referred to as National Social Assistance Scheme. You have umbrella schemes for the development of minorities, development of other vulnerable groups, development of STs and SCs, which are, as I said, will be covered as part of what is called as the sub-plans for these particular communities. Apart from this core of the core schemes, you have what is referred to as core schemes, and there are list of such schemes which have been mentioned here. We will be taking up these schemes one after the other in future videos, and these are some of the schemes that you have to remember and this particular classification also. Moving ahead, these are the major 6 schemes which have been mentioned in the budget as important ones in this particular interim budget, which might be asked in your preliminary examination. As I said, the first one is MGNREGA scheme, and earlier, as you clearly know, that only 60,000 crore allocation was made in the previous financial year. However, now the increase has been made to 86,000 crores, which is matching the estimates that it had in the 2022-2023 financial year. Now, this indicates that there is an element of rural distress and the popular demand for this particular scheme is again still there. Second, the scheme that has been mentioned is this PM Jan Arogya Yojana and then production linked incentive scheme, the modified program for development of semiconductors and display manufacturing ecosystem, the solar power grid, National Green Hydrogen Mission. These are the 6 schemes which have been mentioned. Again, we will be taking up these schemes and the discussion over these schemes in the future videos. That's all for today for this special budget discussion that we had. If you like this initiative, if you like these videos, please do like, share and comment on these videos, and don't forget to subscribe our channel Narayana IAS, the one-stop destination for UPSC Civil Services examination. Thank you one and all.